Welcome back after that sumptuous lunch. Thank you, presidency colleagues, for feeding us so well. Professor Simeon, good afternoon. Now we have two papers back to back by Professors Dilip Simeon and Nishaant Choksi. I will introduce Professor Simeon and ask him to speak right after. Professor Dilip Simeon is a well-known labor historian and a public intellectual. He has taught earlier in Ramjas College, Delhi University, and has been a visiting scholar in many institutions, including the University of Sussex, Princeton University, Leiden University, and SOAS University of London. He is, as I just mentioned, also a public intellectual and civil society activist of repute, with particular interest in conflict and post-conflict studies, and has been writing widely in both popular press and in academic journals around these urgent issues. He is also a member of the executive body of the Association of Indian Labor Historians. He has also been, and that is how we have known him, we who have studied in Delhi in our postgraduate life, we have known him for being at the front ranks of struggle against communal violence, both against anti-Sikh violence and anti-Muslim violence between 1984 and 1990s. And he was very closely linked to the Sampradayika Virodhi Andolan in Delhi, which actually worked on the streets for many years. He's also associated with Oxfam and its conflict mitigation projects, and is the author of the rather poignantly titled book, Revolution Highway, 2010. Professor Simeon, should I ask Upal to read out the message from the Assam Associate, or I will ask him at some point in your talk?
I'll ask him in a few minutes. Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm very happy to be present here with all of you. It's a bit charming for me also because very many years ago, about 50 years ago, I was quite familiar with College Street and with Presidency College and with the very famous Presidency College coffee house, where various revolutionaries would sit and chat. And so I actually met some very, very famous names over there, but I won't go into that right now. This is also an occasion to felicitate Ranjit Guha, whom I knew very long ago. And at the very outset, I should say that this is not a paper so much as a little effort at a reminiscence of interacting with Comrade Ranjit Guha many, many years ago. I was never associated with Ranjit Guha academically. I should make that clear. I was associated with him politically. So we got to know of Ranjit Da when he came to Delhi University. I think it was 1969 or early 70, but I think it may have been 69. And early 70 was when some of my comrades began going underground. And I myself joined and went underground in late 1970. So we knew each other in a very turbulent time, and it was on the campus of Delhi University. He was staying at that time with another well-known academician, Amalindu Guha, who is also a labor historian. And they both stayed in a flat, which had then been vacated by Professor Tapan Rai Chaudhary, who had gone abroad, and they were both sharing that flat. So these are my earliest recollections of Ranjit Guha. as a left-wing professor who was professedly a sympathizer of the Naxalite movement. And these 2 years were the years in which we discussed a great number of questions, politically speaking, about the Indian Revolution, what had happened to it, etc. So I got to know Ranjit Guha in that context. Before anything else, let me say, if he's listening or if he will get to hear that, I remember him with great affection and wish him a very, very happy birthday. And I'm very, very happy that he has reached 100 years, and hopefully he will cross 100 years as well. So now let me say a few things about that time and about what it meant for all of us. We had become convinced by the politics of Naxalism in 1967-68. 67 was when the episode took place in Naxalbari. And little after that, um, there was a big debate carried out in the newspapers, and we followed that debate. And within a few months' time, a few of us in St. Stephen's College became Naxalites. The person who was closest to me was a person called Arvind Narayan Das. And he may have been one of the first. He was the first and last Naxalite president of St. Stephen's College. And later that year, it could have been 1969 or thereabouts, we heard that there was a professor who had come from abroad, from England, and he was currently stationed in Delhi, and he was doing research on Gandhi. And he was overtly an outspoken supporter of the politics of the CPI-ML. The CPI-ML was set up in 1969 on Lenin's birthday, as far as I can remember. And the announcement was made in Calcutta in the Maidan. So we were very excited that there was a professor like this. Of course, there was another professor whom we were very close to, whom Ranjit Da also got to know. His name was Ajit Pal. He was a psychology professor. But he never spoke about doctrine and analysis of history and so on. Ranjit Guha, on the other hand, did. So it was very good to hear him, and we would all sit and talk to him in the coffee house or whatever. So there were a few interactions, and then we began going to his house. To give you an idea of what the atmosphere was for us, I asked, there are many of my friends from those days have unfortunately passed away. There's just a few of us left. And one of them is someone called Monju Barwa. His name is actually Achinte Barwa, and he lives in Assam. And he had a very interesting encounter. We all did, but he recalled it very clearly. So I asked him to write a page or so. So he's written something about encountering Ranjit Guha, which I thought you'd find interesting, and that will give you some idea of the ambience in which we all got to know Ranjit Guha as a political person, as a comrade. So we always called him Comrade Guha. We didn't think of him as an academician, although he was an academician even then. So I've requested Upal to kindly read out something, that one page, which I think you'll find quite entertaining. And then once he reads that, then I'll say a few more words about the kind of interaction we had. Upal, can you please read that out? I don't know whether I'll be able to hear it, but I hope everyone else will.
Yeah, so Dilip Simeon shared this note with me today in the morning. I haven't yet got a chance to read it. I'm reading it for the first time here. It's written by Manju Barua. Ochinto is his good name. From Bochagao village, Kaziranga. It's titled Recollections That Well Up the Eyes. In late 1969, as a second year student, I consider the now late Arvind Narayan Das and Dilip Simeon as my gurus. These two collegians were very knowledgeable, because of which they gained the privilege to interact with Amolendu Guha and Ranajit Guha, who were living together in one of the professor quarters located in a peaceful area north of the Delhi University cricket field. And both Arvind and Dilip were welcomed by these two academic stalwarts to treat their residence as an open house. Now and again, I tagged along with them as their ever faithful sidey. On Wednesdays, our college hostel mess allowed us to invite guests for dinner. And since 1968, every Wednesday evening, Arvind would have a discussion session in his hostel room where 5 or 6 of us resident students were regular participants. Very often, Arvind would have a revered special invitee who would mesmerize us with Marxist gyan, and then the venerated invitee would join us for dinner in our hostel mess. On one such Wednesday session, Amalendu Guha, Amartya Sen, and Ranajit Guha were the special invitees. And that was one occasion that I forever cherish. 3 chairs were placed for them, while 5, 6 of us sat on the floor. St. Stephen's student residence rooms were large, especially the Rudra South rooms. Even then, it was not so roomy for 10 people to get together. I remember being huddled in one corner of the room, sharing a mattress with Munu, Shumanta Banerjee, and Trinanjan, Trini Mitra. Trinanjan was one of our classmates who was reputed to have read Morris Dog while still in school. I don't remember what was discussed in that high funda intellectual session. Lesser mortals like me were incarnations of the Goan D'Souza in Gauri Prasanna Majumdar's song Coffee House's Shei Addata, sung by Vannadev. We sat as voiceless listeners, but maybe like D'Souza, our eyes too were full of unspoken thoughts. আর চোখ ভরা কথা নিয়ে নির্বাক শ্রোতা হয়ে ডিসুজাটা বসে শুধু ভাবত. With eyes full of unspoken thoughts, as a voiceless listener, D'Souza only kept sitting. At that time, Ranajit Guha was a sprightly old man to us, fully supportive of the Naxal cause. After the session ended, he came to our corner of the room and wanted to know our names. Once he knew that Trinanjan was a Bengali and a Kolkata child, he then, as was the dastur of elders of that time, wanted to know Trini's father's name. I was unmindful of the conversation that followed, but it proved that Ranajit Guha knew about Trini's father. Ranajit Guha felt victorious about this, and looking towards Amolendu Guha and Amartya Sen boastfully stated, "Ami SF এর president ছিলুম, কলকাতার 1 লাখ লোককে চিনি. I was SF president, I used to know 1 lakh people in Kolkata." He was standing and we were seated on the floor. He literally towered over us. The mischievous Munu Banerjee may have taken the 1 lakh figure with a pinch of salt, so he pointed at me and said that my Baba too studied in presidency. I felt a bit shy, but Ranajit Guha bent down and asked Baba's name. He then hollered, "Tumi Birinchi Babu chile? Birinchi Babu amar barite roz ashto." It so happened Ranajit Guha's elder brother was my late father's classmate, and both were students of Pali in college and university, and that my Baba was a frequent visitor to their place. I got the impression that Ranajit Guha's elder brother was a bachelor and was informed that at that time he was staying in Goyar Hall, a residential hostel for senior students, and teaching in the Pali department of Delhi University. It also turned out that he was known to the other 2 stalwarts. All 3 of them insisted that I visit Ranajit Babu's brother. This was not to be, as we dropped out of college soon after to pursue revolutionary tasks. But after that Wednesday session in Arvind Das's hostel room, we had no reason to disbelieve Ranajit Babu's claim that he knew 1 lakh people in Kolkata in the mid-1940s. Postscript. Decades later, I took the trouble to find out that my father left his job in Calcutta University in 1938. I also came to know that Ranajit Babu matriculated in that very year. So Ranajit Babu was a school-going lad when my Baba used to visit their house. And now he is 100 years old, eyes do well up with such recollections. Monju Ochinto Borua, Bochagao Village, Kaziranga, December 8, 2020.
So, can you hear me now? I hope everyone can hear. Okay, I'll just carry on. So this was the atmosphere in which I, along with my comrades, got to know Comrade Ranjit. So what we shared was comradeship. He was very democratic, so he lent his house for the painting of posters. He would also kneel on the floor and make posters along with us. He would warn us that revolution was not a dinner party, as Chairman Mao used to say. He would say that comrades will beat up and be beaten. So we heard all these things. And he also, of course, he had a running battle with Professor Amalendu Guha, who was sympathetic to the CPIM. And Ranjit was, of course, very, very inclined towards the CPI-ML. He used to declare it. I won't go into the details of what he said. It might get us all into trouble. And it's also very interesting that he once called a whole lot of professors from Delhi School of Economics to convince them that revolution was actually happening. And so there we were in that professor's quarter with a big map of India behind us and with a pointer. And these senior professors, some of whom have already been named, so I won't name them again. They were sitting on the floor, and we were with a pointer pointing to how the Red Army had been formed in Naxalbari and was marching to Cape Comorin, etc., etc. So this was the kind of atmosphere that prevailed. And soon after that, however, so these were about a stormy 18 months or so, during which we had many discussions with Ranjita, and we had many meetings. There was a lot of activities going on, but things began to get more serious in 1970, and people began to leave for the underground. And the first to go were my friend Rabindra Ray and Arvind Narayan Das. Both of them have passed away. Rabindra Ray just passed away in 2019. So thereafter, Ranjit left for England. So there was a hiatus in our meeting and so on. We all went underground and things began to get very heated. I won't go into those details, but he went back to Sussex. I think that the police was also interested in him, and he may have been interrogated or visited by the police on a couple of occasions. Let me also say that that was the time when we got to know his wife, Mechteld, who is still with him. So after that, I didn't meet him for some time. After the stormy period of Naxalism ended, that first phase was 1969 to 1971-72. As you know, the Bangladesh War took place at that time, and I happened to be in Kolkata during the Bangladesh War. Let me tell you, it was a very, very gruesome scenario, but this is not the time to discuss it. After that, I decided to get out, and I was sent by my parents to England in July 1972. And so that was the time later that year, it could have been December, that I visited Sussex University and met Comrade Ranjit and Mechteld in Sussex University campus. So that was the first time after the Naxalite period was over that we actually met. So I was able to exchange some thoughts with him about what had happened. So let me make it clear that as far as I was concerned, I was out of, I was no longer in a kind of Maoist euphoria. I had seen too many things, and it had been quite traumatic for many of us. Some of my comrades were in jail, spent a lot of time in jail. We were lucky that amongst our friends, nobody actually suffered more than that, more than just a jail experience. But whatever it is, there were many other friends who passed away, and it was very traumatic. So we were able to have a discussion. And in the discussion, it was clear that he was a bit disabused of the CPI-ML, although he still sympathized with the idea of armed struggle and revolution in India and so on. I remember him saying that as regards the theory of the party, he believed that Stalin's theory of the party was the only solid um, uh, theory that he adhered to. So this was his state of mind. In 1974, I got a job in Delhi University, and which I retained until 1994. But I remember a few months after getting my job, it could have been October or November, I got a message from St. Stephen's College campus, in particular, my friend Shahid Amin's house. Shahid's father was our teacher, Muhammad Amin. So I got a message saying that you are required to present yourself at Muhammad Amin's house. So I went there, and there was Comrade Ranjit, who was visiting India. And we sat on the porch and we had a chat and discussed various things, old times and so on. But that was the first time he told me of his intention to launch subaltern studies. He didn't say it in so many words, but I remember him saying, "We will keep up the struggle." So my hair stood on end for a while. I wondered what he had up his sleeve now. But what he meant was that we will keep up the struggle in the realm of historiography. And he uttered a few harsh words for certain leading historians and so on. So that it became clear that he was planning an academic intervention. And this is my understanding. His academic intention was always to put forward an argument in the sphere of historiography for his approach to the Indian Revolution. I can explain this best by, it's a huge story, but there's not enough time. But I can explain it best by a single sentence which sums up his approach to subaltern studies. And this is probably in the most important intervention he has made in subaltern studies. I wrote a review of subaltern studies some years ago. It was published in the International Encyclopedia of the Behavioral Sciences, but we'll leave that out. This is from his essay in Subaltern Studies, Volume 6, and it's called Dominance Without Hegemony and Its Historiography. Arguably, it's his most important theoretical intervention. But leave that aside. The sentence I have in mind is on page 307. It reads, "The price of blindness about the structure of the colonial regime as a dominance without hegemony has been for us a total want of insight into the character of the successor regime too as a dominance without hegemony." This is a straightforward articulation of his political position, and I frankly disagree with it. As I said, I was never part of subaltern studies. I knew Comrade Ranjit Guha as a political comrade. I did not associate it with this project, although we remained very affectionate and there was friendship and so on. So that was 1973. In As I said, 1974 is when this episode took place, when I met him in Shahid's house and Professor Muhammad Amin's house. After that, frankly, I lost touch and never met him again until 1995 in Princeton. And I'd like to take the occasion to say hello to my friend Gyan Prakash. I heard a small part of his lecture in the morning. If he's still there, then hello again, Gyan. So 1995, Ranjit visited Princeton. And by then, he was very, very famous as the person who was the founder and editor-in-chief of Subaltern Studies. And he gave a talk. This was, I remember, it was the 5th of May, 1995. And the hall was absolutely full. Various senior professors, In fact, Nobel Prize winners and so on for literature were all there. So it was very interesting. And I came in a bit late. So we hailed each other. We sat down and listened. So he gave a talk on George Orwell, I remember. And after that, I asked him a couple of questions, but we leave that aside. Gyan then organized a dinner for us one day. I found that very funny. I won't take much more time because I don't really have that much more to say. Gyan organized a dinner. We went to his house, and it was a very funny occasion because Ranjit Da was there, but there was also a professor, a Pakistani professor called Akbar Ahmed, I think his name was. And he was there also. And there was Mahmood Mamdani and Gyan. So we were all sitting there. And I remember I came a little bit late. And I sat next to Ranjit Da, and he bent low to me and said, "This fellow is a stupid fool," pointing to the Pakistani professor. So I said, "What is the matter?" So apparently that chap had taken the word subaltern to mean a study of lesser ranks in the Indian army. So he said, "This guy thinks I'm studying the army." So I said, "So because that's what subaltern means." So he was a bit outraged that he had never heard of subaltern studies, and he was quite clueless as to the focus of its work and so on. Anyway, that was the last time. And thereafter, my own book was published. I sent him a copy of it when I could, but we have not been in touch after that. Earlier this year, I saw a piece written in Scroll saying that Ranjit Guha this is his 100th year. And so out of respect for him, I posted that article on my blog. And soon after that, Upal and a few other of the organizers of this conference, they got in touch with me and said, "We would like you to come to Calcutta and speak," and so on. Unfortunately, I can't be there physically, but I'm there in spirit. And I wanted to share a few things about Ranjit Guha from what we remembered about him. So let me just close by saying, as I said, for me, he was always a comrade and is still a comrade, regardless of different positions. He was a very lovable, and he is a very lovable and affectionate man. And he was very democratic. When I remember him with his knees on the ground, painting slogans, and that was it. So, of course, the whole enterprise of Naxalism is an entirely different issue. And that is what I feel that we should also discuss at some point, maybe not in this conference, because in some ways it is still going on, the Naxalite movement, but there is something deeply troubling about the whole episode. I'll just close by saying that soon after, some of my friends got out of jail and so on. One of them reported to me that someone had written under the wall slogan, "Chiner chairman, Amader chairman." You may or may not know that was one of the famous slogans of the Naxalite movement. Chiner chairman, Amader chairman, Chiner path, Amader path. So apparently somebody had written underneath it, "A Japaner Raja, Amader Raja." So that I found very funny. But this is something which I was never able to report to Ranjit Da. Anyway, with these few words, and thanks to all of you, I will end. And of course, if people want to ask me questions at some point, they're most welcome to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Simeon. That was really charming. What we'll do is we'll have the next presentation, and then we'll take questions for both the papers. All right, thank you very much. That was wonderful. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my old friend, Nishaant Choksi, who's also, to let out a secret, an incredible polyglot. He speaks multiple languages, and I'm a great admirer of his work. Nishant's new book is just out last year, if I'm not mistaken. It's called Graphic Politics in Eastern India, Script and the Quest for Autonomy, 2021. Nishaant is a sociolinguist and an anthropologist, and did his PhD from the University of Michigan, and followed by a postdoctoral at Kyoto University of Japan. He is currently teaching in the Indian Institute of Technology, Gandhinagar in Gujarat. His research areas include the study of scripts and writing systems, language and performance, the aesthetic component of language and speech, cultural politics of heritage, and of course, political economy, livelihood, and politics of autonomy. His work primarily focuses on the world of Adivasi communities of India, and his fieldwork is in the Santal speaking regions, Mundari speaking regions, and in the hill regions. But he's also done projects in the Northeast and has published widely in specialist as well as academic journals that we also read. Some of his work is very technical. I'm hoping that Nishaant will go easy on us on that. So Nishant's presentation is called Icons and Indexes, Ranajit Guha and the Semiotic Historiography of the Santal Hul. Nishaant.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, yeah. So, yeah, thank you, everyone. I, of course, didn't know Ranajit Guha personally at all, but I'm happy to be here. Some of my teachers are here. Prathama Banerjee was my teacher also, and Bodhida, and also. In my UG at University of Chicago, Dipesh Chakravarti was the one who his presence there. Of course, we didn't know anything about subaltern studies or anything like that, but his presence there really introduced us to the subject, and I'll be engaging with his work as well as Ranajit Guha's as well in this talk. So Ranajit Guha's celebrated essay, The Prose of Counterinsurgency, has, of course, influenced generations of students and scholars, both of history and allied disciplines, anthropology, sociology, South Asian studies in general. The essay is often considered a hallmark of historiographical method, setting the stage for what was to later become subaltern historiography. And if one looks back, it may seem a bit dated, and it's come under criticism. For instance, in anthropology, people like Shiva Ramakrishnan, who worked in Jungle Mahal, he's criticized it as being too structuralist. Famously, Dipesh Chakrabarti, whose critique I'll also talk about, has argued that it relies on an untenable notion of religion to explain subaltern agency. And as a work of history also, it's been surpassed. So for instance, now there's, recently there's many good histories of the Santal Hul, which are much more expansive, such as Peter Stanley's recent book just came out. It's available in India. Even in there, he criticizes Guha for being too theoretical, right, as historians sometimes do. So I'm not a student of history. I'm a student of anthropology and linguistics, right? So what I, rereading this essay, I remember this essay had a impact on me and in my trajectory, and I was wondering, partly because it was the critique of it in provincializing Europe led me there, but then rereading it, I saw that the very important role that semiotics played in it, actually, in its theoretical architecture. So, what I feel was that Guha was actually proposing something like a semiotic historiography, right? That that in later readings, and I think was mainly overlooked. Now, perhaps Guha himself didn't really develop this in later works, or it could be the result of the adoption of post-structuralist theories, which in the role of semiosis was subordinated a bit in favor of something else, like recovering the silent subject or other such things. So, but I would like to suggest in this presentation that the very semiotic framework that Guha proposes allows us to move beyond this referential aspect of history, right? And discover the way linguistic and narrative forms shape, often under the threshold of our awareness, academic practice. So I would like to do this particularly in relationship to agency and the Santal Hul, right? And then counterpose this essay along with the critique, influential critique in provincializing Europe. And then I'll talk about a little bit about my own field work, working on the idea of writing in the Santali-speaking areas. So first, the essay and semiotic historiography. So after laying out this assertion that in most historical analyses, insurgency is regarded as external to the peasant's consciousness, in part 5 of the essay, Prose of Counterinsurgency, Guha attempts to theoretically understand how this has come to be the case. He says that the problem is not in the content of the archive, which, anyway, we situate content in particular contexts, right? But in the discursive form of the archive that structures interpretation. So drawing on Barthes and Benveniste, Guha says that meaning comprises of 2 components, right? One is the function that's the understanding of discourse in sequence, basically, linguistic sequence, and the other is the index, right, which is the integrative aspect of language, in which sequential units are synthesized. So he gives a basic example, like a Bangla sentence, she jabe, as an example of a function. We just understand that, right, she jabe. And then he gives a complex utterance, like she na hoy na jabe, right, as something that doesn't follow a sequence, but we have to kind of integrate it up to understand it. So this is what he calls index, right? So Guha, is drawing on the structuralist tradition, which I think Bodhida will talk about, tomorrow. But I would suggest that also that the resonances of his suggestions, I would like to place it together with the work of the American semiotician Charles Sanders Peirce, and see what the semiotic historiography could look like. So Saussure believed the sign was a 2-part structure, right? There's a signifier and a signified. But Peirce said that there's a 3rd part, which he called it interpretant. Now, what is an interpretant? It's those features of the object which are interpreted as sign, but it can be different on the way a cognizing subject views the relation between sign and object. For instance, index is a relation of contiguity. So if I see smoke, then of course I assume that somewhere there's fire, right? Icon is one of resemblance. For instance, if there's a picture of fire, then we can say, okay, it's a fire hazard. Then there's the symbol. Symbol is a conventional form, right? It's a notion of abstraction. So if I see a tricolor, I can say, okay, yes, India, right? That's just purely conventionalized. So as Guha notes in the essay, the idea of index is particularly important for linguistic analysis. It allows interpretation of utterances at different levels, beyond the sequence, right? Index also has an important role to play in linguistic theory, where, Peirce's idea of index was developed by Roman Jakobson, who is a linguist, who Guha cites in the essay. And one of Jakobson's students, Michael Silverstein, who is at University of Chicago also, into what the concept is called indexicality, or indexical order. In this framework, the meaning of any given utterance, n, right, which is called a meaning n, is indexically connected to the multiplicity of meanings at higher levels of interpretation, right? There's n and then n plus 1, like it keeps on going. Now these orders interact in dialectical relation to one another, and their interactions are form a historically and contextually situated metasemiotic frame, right? That's what we can call ideology, through which utterances are produced and interpreted. Now Guha elucidates this as he combs through the archive. He first focuses on the linguistic elements in which he calls the primary discourse, right? That are the eyewitness accounts of insurgency, He shows historiography is for historiography, what is important is not the nouns and the verbs, right? But the overlooked elements, like the adjectives, right? Fanatic, daring and wanton, defiant, which appear repeatedly in various sources. These are indexical and dialectically conditioned by a higher order binary frame, right? Which he calls, he draws from Mao. He says, it's terrible or it's fine, right? So you can kind of put any interpretation of insurgency through this frame. And so this is what he calls, this meta-semiotic frame is what he calls the code of pacification, right? Which frames the rules for writing historical discourse. So that's the prose, that's what he later calls prose of counterinsurgency. So he shows how this operates in secondary and tertiary levels, right? So for instance, the aorist past, the past tense, the first person, indexing objectivity, nostalgia, organization shifters. So what are shifters? Shifters are words that don't have a referential meaning, like here, now, right? These are temporal shifters. Now, then, or here, there, spatial shifters, right? But for temporally, they're very critical for constructing the frame of interpretation. So by using these shifters strategically, colonial historians, quote, dechronologize the historical thread and impose a kind of nonlinear temporality, braiding the chronology of the subject matter with that of the language act that reports it. These are Guha's words. So what results through this use of language are binaries at the higher level of interpretation, right? Authority versus defiance, servility versus self-respect. Now we see that, as Guha says, the pattern of a historian's choice becomes identical with the magistrate's, right? It conforms to the code of counterinsurgency. Now later, Guha turns specifically to the Hul, which we'll talk about, right? Citing Hunter's account, which while seemingly sympathetic to the Santals, follows the same code as he outlined earlier, right? Hunter strings together, the chronology of the 1855 uprising. He characterizes the major actors, right? The honest and simple Santals, the cunning Hindu landlords, the benign but incompetent company, right? Each linguistic choice he uses indexes a, quote, testament of faith in colonialism. But here, Guha points out an added problem, right? It's not just one of narration, right? But also representation, right? Hunter's text conventionalizes these indexes of counterinsurgency. They transform the honest and hardworking Santal into a Persian symbol, right? A symbol of the forward march of English enterprise. So the Hul, right, in the nationalist discourse becomes symbolic of national independence, right? Or in the Marxist discourse, it becomes, a proto-class struggle, right? So each semiotic process just replicates one another. So Prathama has talked about this in her work on temporality and the historiography of the Santal Hul, and where she engages directly with these questions. And what resulted from Hunter's work and his legacy, is that the people who inspired fear and respect in the minds of the company officials, right, the Santals, became pacified, not only militarily, but also discursively, right? As Guha says, they became a contingent element in another history with another subject. Now, Guha, in this essay, proposes an alternative, I would say, right? He starts by saying that contrary to the abstractions in the secondary and tertiary discourse, what was, quote, by all accounts central to the Hul was religiosity. Now, perhaps this was an unfortunate use of words, especially now, in the times we live in, but he does specify what it means, right? He says religiosity is, it doesn't imply that power was a concept wrapped up in a form external to it, called religion, right? So we shouldn't say that religiosity is indexical to religion. Instead, he puts forth a counter-reading to counterinsurgency, in which he proposes that Santal agency should be seen as iconic, right? That is a relation not of contiguity, but of resemblance between the consciousness and the event. He states it explicitly. What he means by religiosity is the, quote, collapse of the signifier and the signified, right? And then he emphasizes it once more by referencing the Sanskrit invocation of Kalidasa's Raghuvansham, right? Where he says, Vagartha viva sampruktao. Now that means that that vach and arth, right? That's word and sense are blended together, right? In one. So this is iconic, right? And what I think my interpretation or reading is that he's drawing on a different tradition to posit a path forward for post-colonial historiography. By specifying agency semiotically, he's pointing us to a different agenda than someone like Said, who says in his introduction to the 1988 Subaltern Studies volume that the task of subaltern studies and its Western analogs is to, quote, articulate the hidden or suppressed accounts of numerous groups, right, such as the Santal. But I think Guha is making the point that historians work with an archive, and their primary task, and all they can do, actually, is to interpret what an archive says. However, what can be done is to question the frames through which you interpret, right? To challenge us to attend to the language, structure, and formal mechanisms we use to constitute historical or any kind of disciplinary discourse. So I don't think there's an effect, there's no like recovery. There's no recovery here, right? On the contrary, Guha says explicitly that these so-called supernatural instances of Santal religiosity are just there for all to see, right? They populate the archive. And he says that in footnote 38 of the essay, that he said the examples of these are too numerous to cite in an essay of this size. So it's not lack of evidence. We have a lot of evidence, right? Of whatever we say, these divine appearances, commands, rituals, right? The problem is what the index was taken up of this evidence. It was indexical of fanaticism, superstition, right? And simply excluded in the conventionalization of the Santal subject as a symbol. So Guha was not alone in his proposal of the iconic as a starting point to understand the post-colonial or maybe non-colonial truth. That's what Ajay Skadia was talking about. Although to my knowledge, he was one of the earlier ones to do so, right? Only around a decade or so later did this proposition was echoed in the study of South Asia by anthropologist E. Valentine Daniel, who adopted a semiotic framework to examine Tamil personhood, where he writes, the very truth of ritual in South Asia is constituted to a large extent in and through iconicity, right? But Daniel is much more limited in his scope, because he says that truth is contained in ritual, right? But for Guha, it's a modality of political consciousness, right? A critical theoretical tool for developing a democratic post-colonial historiography. Now, I think this use of semiotics kind of really was diminished over time, right? Maybe by Guha himself, and then by maybe later in the ways that this essay was taken up. So for example, we can take up Dipesh Chakrabarty's, where he engages directly with the essay, right, in chapter 4 of the book, where he argues that, at least in my reading, that religiosity is essentially untenable and seeks to replace this proposition with the notion of subaltern pasts, which he describes as a supplement to historians' past, right? And he shows the limits of history, right? Something Guha takes up later also, I think. These are unknowable. He says Santal agency is unknowable by the historian because its logic relies on a notion of religion, which cannot be captured by any known possible modes of historical discourse. Now, the transformation of what he calls minority histories to Santal pasts might be related to Said's assertion of the task of subaltern studies, right, to show the limits of articulation, right, of the hidden or suppressed, And when Chakrabarty makes this critique, he talks about the analytical distance from what he refers to as that the historian must take, right, to the logic of Santal consciousness. It's not possible for Guha to inhabit consciousness right? But in my reading, from a semiotic point of view, it's not, I don't think Guha is attempting to speak from any subject position, right, except that of a historian. It's his semiotic methodology which allows him to critique, right, beyond content, colonial and post-colonial historiography. So he takes an equal analytical distance from company officials, the nationalist and Marxist historians, and the Santals, right? In fact, it's only this democratic distancing which allows him to build a semiotic analysis through which agency can be related to a different interpretant than that produced by the prose of counterinsurgency. So this logic, I would say, is operative at the level of historiographical, right? So just as index allows Guha to discern an ideological code of counterinsurgency, icon allows Guha to capture what he calls Santal consciousness from the same archive. So Chakrabarti also quotes the same passage in section 13, right? Where that's how he builds the argument. But it's interesting because the one part he did leave out, I just found that interesting as I was just going back through the materials, is that reference to the semiotic architecture, right? That connects the previous, that section to the previous one. That's that short clause, right? That Sanskrit quote discussing the inseparability of the signifier and the signified in the language of the whole, right? So, without that, then we can conventionalize religiosity, right, into religion, right? So, you can talk about it, and he talks about it, right, as a counterpoise to the secular of history, right? There's all other distinctions that he made, like between history, which is based on rules of evidence, and anthropology, through which its own modernist procedures converts evidence into somebody else's belief, making them objects of analysis, right? So the way these disciplines are formed. Yet in my reading, I don't know, it seems that Guha is not actually concerned with this formation of disciplines, right? Because each discipline, it starts with abstraction. That's what Peirce calls an argument, right? Which is the symbolic, rather than the iconic or indexical. So, if one starts with this kind of abstractions, you foreclose a very problematic of interpretation that forms the crucible of the essay, which is a methodological question of how we develop a historiographical frame outside the prose of counterinsurgency. And how do we reinterpret the sign relations present in the archive? So, the goal of semiotic historiography, I would say, is to open up new ways of interpretation by challenging the dominant form of historical discourse and frames of interpretation and production. And in the second half of the essay, I think Guha makes considerable effort to show how thus far interpretations of the actions of the whole have been taken up as symbolic, right? That is conventionalized in terms of other discourse, right? Such as nationalism or orthodox Marxism. But my question is that, if you take it instead of this symbolic of Marxism or nationalism, but you make it symbolic of subaltern pasts or subaltern studies, in that sense, subaltern, what Chakrabarti calls a subaltern past, isn't that also a same kind of starting from abstraction, right? So in that sense, then what do we get? Maybe we get the limits of historicizing, right? Where does that leave then historiography? I think nowhere, really. I mean, I think Partha Chatterjee talked about today's. You don't, nowhere, you just go to literature, you go just somewhere else, right? So, I think that from Guha's essay, we can see, we could actually try and think about how we might rework those orders of signification through which historicization occurs, right? And we can guide history into new frontiers through understanding it as a formal discourse or a linguistic act, which is semiotic, right? Now, just to give some examples, right? There's certain new opportunities, I think, if we look at the historiography of the Santal Hul. Nowadays there's a much greater access to different kinds of accounts, not just from the colonial archive. So in Stanley's book, he shows that there's so much colonial material there. But there's in the Santali language, right? These Norwegian missionaries and their Santal collaborators who entered in the Santal Parganas in the decades following the Hul, collected numerous accounts of Hul survivors, Hulrek Katha, which are stored in the National Library in Oslo, but have recently been digitized and are now easily accessible. Now, these are in Santali, so I think that's good, right? It adds further possibility, right, for conducting a semiotic analysis through linguistic form, right, that may have been unavailable to Guha, even though he said that there was already plenty of evidence which he didn't use. Now, some of these stories have been translated, but I'm saying in the process of translation, for instance, Santali to Bangla, Santali to English, right? While people are doing that, or going back, then one can get historical insights, right, from a semiotic perspective. So you can use literature, you can use various things that deal with language to get historical insights. So now, just because you have a Santali language text, of course, doesn't mean that these accounts represent an authentic voice, right? That's another thing semiotic, historiography, I'd say, would distance itself from. So for instance, these texts that were in the National Library, they were made for missionaries, right? Missionaries got them, and the Santal collaborators, even though they're in Santali. So there's a complex code of religion, right? Not religiosity, but religion, right? Formal speaking, that conditioned these later interpretations of historical events, right? And then you have other archives, right? Now, Hul songs, for instance, are something still popular. If you go to Jungle Mahal, if you go to Jharkhand, these people still sing Hul songs, Hul Sereng, right? And this is, it's still being done, and it was done right after the Hul as well. There are material in the missionary archive. These are archived in textual transcription. And a team led by Rahi Soren in Jadavpur University has collected very early recordings of these songs, right? Not at the time of the Hul, of course, but early recordings of these. So these add even new possibilities for discerning history and the afterlives of the event of the Hul through different kind of modality, right? Sonic, right? You can look at dance, that's kinetic, right? These are all different kinds of ways of thinking about history. So exciting new work on the Hul, along with establishing the new archives and training of historians who are proficient in Santali. Now we have Santali departments in many universities in West Bengal, right? But they're not really trained in a historical way, right? I mean, the training, it's mostly literature. That'll result in a complex discourse of the events of the Hul. However, without a semiotic approach, we may revert back to the discursive modalities that Guha warned us about. That's why it's not only content, right, but also form. So I can just give one example of my own work, which is, I'll wrap up. To draw, when I look at writing, right, this term ol, which is writing, drawing, and ritual inscription, right? It appears in the archives, Santal language missionary archives, and colonial accounts, right? And I posit correspondences between the ways in which writing was invoked in the Hul and then later in the Jharkhand movement, which led to the proliferation of script making, right? And then that's the graphic politics of script I talk about, right? And so you could interpret the Hul through this kind of graphic iconicity, right? That appears over and over again, this idea of ol, right? So just to wrap up, I think Guha has shown us a method by which scholars must interrogate both form and content and realize that they're involved in communicative and therefore necessarily ideological work. Though what we may say may differ on our social and political positionality, access to archives, or lived experiences, but how we say it may continue to ensnare us within the prose of counterinsurgency. It is unfortunate that the so-called linguistic turn, excised language, at the very foundation of historical discourse from both theory and methodology. But I think Ranajit Guha may, at least in this work, set out a blueprint for a semiotic historiography for which we can return. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishaant. So we are quite short on time. Upal, how long do we have? 20 minutes. So maybe we should just take one round of long round of questions and then come back to the speakers. Is that all right? So please raise your hands. Okay, Upal. Any other hands at this point? Shukanna? Acha, Upal, go ahead. We'll have more hands soon. And then Shukanna. But Professor Simeon, you're able to hear us, right?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Nishaant, thanks for the thoughts. This is Prathama warned us, and it remained technical, I would say. This is from whatever general reading of linguistics and semiotics that compulsorily we undergo. I ask from that understanding. You see, the differences that you were talking about towards the end of your paper, the plethora of different materials that can be used to engage the semiotic historiography of whole in a new way, maybe. So I was thinking that, how do you look, as in the Peircean structure of the relationship between the iconic, the indexical, and the symbolic? Will this work despite this different material and media? So this is what I was thinking about. That is this structure, applicable or usable in the way Ranajit Guha was using colonial archival material written in a particular European language, let's say English, and then you move to other language. The language itself is a question, and then there is the question of the variety of media. So how do you think of this difference, the variety that you talked about, and the semiotic, tool that you also pegged your kind of argument to?
Great, thanks. Upal, Shukanna. We are just taking questions quickly and then, yeah?
So my question is also for Nishaant. So again, very interesting paper, and again, very technical. So it's a methodological question as far as I see it, how to read the archive, how to read the symbols of the language in the archive. And you talk about how Guha might be taking an equidistant location vis-a-vis, all the kinds of readings possible till then and even after. My question is about, the idea of resemblance here. So if I have understood correctly, we are not trying to understand religiosity as a representation of consciousness, but we are trying to understand resemblances between consciousness and the event in terms of iconicity. Is that right? Now, well, if that is the case, but I'd still, I partly know what kind of problems my question might give rise to, but I still want to hear your thoughts, sort of commit to something, which is about if we are thinking of resemblance between consciousness and events, do we not, does the event influence the consciousness or vice versa? I know we are moving away from the paradigm of influence, but still, if we are talking about resemblance, and if we are reading an archive, we have to have some kind of a committal, sort of standpoint therein. That's what I'm wondering about.
Great, Saurabh.
So my question is really comes after what Chukanya have asked, and I found your committed, intriguing, and strenuous reading compelling and enabling on your registers at any rate. But I just had a few sort of points to make. One of them is it's simple-minded, but you might consider reading the prose of counterinsurgency together with elementary aspects of peasant insurgency in colonial India. And I say this in part because the two texts do not quite work in tandem. In fact, the prose of counterinsurgency, it seems to me, emerges out of the, out of what remained, out of the remains of elementary aspects of peasant insurgency. And what I mean by this is also, and this is a provocation, perhaps Ranajit Guha did not follow up on it because there was not that much more which could be done with his analysis in the prose of counterinsurgency. In simple-minded terms, it was a one-off piece. It had met its own end. Alongside, I would say, but what you've done is quite fabulous. And in that respect, I'd suggest you might want to consider, and this relates to the point Mr. Kanya was making, you might want to bring in sort of considerations of, what Evans Pritchard had discussed in relation to the Azande oracle, because there are questions there of not just of belief, but actually of truth. And religion not reduced to belief. And which gets me to Dipesh's reading in Minority History Subaltern Past. I think Dipesh's point was really not against, he was not railing against religion, but he was speaking about how the presence of the presence of ghosts and spirits is rendered in an account which has to lean back on the secular credentials, which are not necessarily only abstract protocols, but which are about which have to enact certain forms of excision. Right. So you might just wish to think about these.
So if we don't have another question immediately, we'll come back to it. Professor Simeon, may I request you that I know that it's a commemorative occasion of Happy Thoughts, but would you consider also putting on the table your differences of opinion with Guha's understanding of the peasant and your understanding of peasant movements during the 1970s that led you both on distinct paths? I think that will enrich our debate if you kind of come in on that a little bit. So Professor Simeon, go ahead, and then Nishaant will come in, right?
Okay, I'll just say a few words because it's a big theme and we don't really have that much time. But one of my problems, it's not a question of just of peasant revolution. It's just the entire communist movement has been engrossed with the question of why the Indian Revolution failed. They did not notice that there had been a massive change in 1947. So the interpretation of the independence of India as something which is just a continuation of dominance without hegemony is something which I think is fundamentally flawed. This is a realization which I came to only after the whole thing ended, because there was utter disaster in the ranks of the CPIML, the details of which one just cannot discuss now, but there was a schism developing even while there was a show of unity. There was a schism developing over the war in Bangladesh and the Bangladeshi independence movement and so on. So this is a very big issue, but it led to a complete collapse. People don't perhaps know, but the CPIML leadership sent a delegation all the way to China. They went by a very interesting and circuitous route. And the report that they came back with was that even the Chinese Communist Party disagreed with Charu Mazumdar's line, and yet that was not made public. So the whole movement got fragmented, but I think that fragmentation is at the root of Leninism. So I have a whole entire critique of Leninism, but this is, as I said, not the time to present it. So that's one issue, the interpretation of the so-called Indian Revolution. Secondly, the focus of subaltern studies was always on how somehow or the other the national leadership which downplayed class divisions was, had a universalistic pretension about the nation, how it was actually always sabotaging radical peasant movements and so on. Therefore, the point is that subaltern studies surely should have studied those political currents in India which did not downplay class, but for which class analysis and class struggle was at the heart of their theory. In short, subaltern studies should have engaged with the communist movement, but I don't find it has done so. I may be wrong, but I read through about 12 volumes. I don't find any study of the communist movement, which is rather strange considering the main critique is that those people who downplayed class rose to prominence, and those people who paid attention to class struggle were ignored. So this is a glaring problem, in my view, with subaltern studies. Thirdly, the working class does not seem to be present in subaltern studies, barring maybe one or two articles, essays by Dipesh. Dipesh wrote a whole book on it. But even in his book, I found that it seems that the national movement did not affect the working class at all. In my own study of the labor movement in Jamshedpur and Jharia, I found that the national movement affected the working class very deeply, although in completely different ways than the national leadership might have wanted. The fourth issue is that the concept of ideology is often used, but the concept of ideology itself is not analyzed. So if you talk about the pros of counter-revolution, you should also talk about the pros of revolution. So the entire approach I find is lacking somewhere. And there was only one article I found, it was called In Search of a Subaltern Lenin, at a time when a fair amount of research had already been done on the revolution, on the Russian Revolution. And there should have been more, if indeed subaltern studies was concerned with more than just India, there should have been more study of what actually happened to revolutionary movements in a spirit of honest historiography.
Thank you very much. That was frank and very useful for us to think with. There's one last question, I think. We'll just quickly take that. Rochna, go ahead, and then we'll come back.
So my question is for Nishaant. Thank you so much. That was a very, very rich talk. Am I audible? And in some ways, I wish I could read it because there were so many nuances to your talk. But very briefly, could you just talk about what place or what is your critique of literature exactly? And to elaborate a little bit on that, it seems to me that there's a division of labor going on here where historiography is tasked with a certain kind of political intent and political possibility, which somehow gets drained when you move into the realm of literature. Did I misunderstand you, or is that what you were trying to suggest in your recuperation of linguistic anthropology and semiotic systems and science and so forth from the literary?
That's certainly what Partho suggested.
That's right.
I
mean,
yeah.
Except, he ended on a note where he said that when he invoked Doya, and he said that there are certain more enduring, I would have asked him this if he was here, that do we then not task historiography with asking enduring questions? That would seem to me to be a very bankrupt historiography. But he's not here, so the question cannot be directed at him.
Okay. There's another question. See? Yeah, go ahead. You just take the mic, yeah.
Hi, Nishaant. Yeah, I was just wondering, you have read about the Santal Hul, and you are also very fluent in Santali as well. So as you had mentioned, there are very many texts and archival material as well, which are now emerging or perhaps being dealt upon now. So what would be your thoughts on if it is similar or different on the readings what Ranajit Guha had interpreted. Yeah.
Go ahead. I think that's it. Nishan, go ahead.
Okay. Hello.
Thank you. Yeah, apologies for that. I tried to make it as less technical as possible, but it ended up being technical. But I think, in return, as a return gift, I received very complicated questions. So, but they were very insightful. So maybe if I can just take them one at a time. Is that okay? I listed them. So, so Upal's question about the different kind of texts. So can we, I mean, is it fair to kind of apply the same methodology or the same, say, if we're talking semiotics, like the same structure to different kind of texts? Because Ranajit Guha was very much talking about the archive, right? How you like looking at a colonial archive, and I'm bringing in, I can bring in different kinds of media and other, like in my own work, I'm ethnography, song, other things, and I'm also proposing that. So, yeah, I think this is an important question to ask. My position on it is that if we are talking, I think at the foundation of what I was trying to say was about a theory of language, right, in general, communication, right, that in which is necessarily semiotic. And so that if these media have communicative modalities, then I think we can understand it in the same way. So maybe what I was proposing was that this text, Prose of Counterinsurgency, really opens up the archive, right? Opens up historiography to understanding different kinds of media, not just the archive, through this architecture. Because if you read the essay, it really just starts. I mean, yeah, I was a bit technical, but that essay is also pretty technical, right? It just starts with language right away, right? I was surprised. I was like, well, how did he get so much as a historian? I don't think subsequently, I haven't read many historians that have such an attraction towards understanding like nuances of grammar and these kind of things. And he just starts right away. So why? I think that's a question we can raise. Why does he do that? And why is he so fascinated? Even in his later works in Limits of History and everything, he starts, these are some digressions he makes, where it's like all of a sudden you're reading about something Sanskrit play, and then he gets like into Panini grammar, like very, intensely. So I think that it seems like, I don't know if he's doing it, but the way he's thinking is opening up to make language as a foundation of how we are, understanding things. And if we make language as a foundation, then we can open up to different kinds of communicative modalities. And historiography can open up to that. Does it remain historiography? Maybe it can, if archive is the base, right? And if these things, if we're talking about events, so yeah. Is that? Sukanya's question, yeah, that's a difficult one. Consciousness in the event and resemblance, right? So does the event influence consciousness, or consciousness influence the event, if we're trying to understand it as iconic? I think that it certainly does have an influence, but I think what if we try to look at it as, consciousness and event, right, are transforming in the process of a, historical or time, I guess, right, how time is understood. So, but I think maybe what Guha was pointing out was that that if you're understanding it as separate, then you're not grasping their transformations together, right? You know, that you have to understand that as they're transforming together, and in certain kinds of spaces, certain kinds of events, like maybe the Santal Hul is one of those. You have to understand these as transforming together, and then also bringing in things that don't follow clear historical, like, you know, our clear sequentiality. So I think maybe just resemblance gives some methodological way to look at it differently, like from a different vantage point. Like, what if we see these, you know, what if we see things going together? I kind of, in, you know, another kind of very brief talk I gave in something related to this, I kind of talked about like correspondences. I don't know if that's the proper word, but something like that. I think this may be going in that direction, but it's certainly, yeah, I would need to discuss it more. Okay, so, sorry, this question. Yeah, so prose of counterinsurgency is a one-off. It could be a one-off, right? If you read it in Ranajit Guha's whole Ur. Yeah, I mean, it I think nowhere is this articulated in this way like this essay. So maybe my question to those of you, to those people who knew him, was like, why did he write this? Or maybe, I don't know, maybe you were thinking it's just taking up some pieces from the other and sort of experimentation with, you know, certain strands of structuralism which he's developing. But it's interesting, as you know, I was just mentioning in response to a post question, that he does go back to language quite a bit, right? He does do that, and in various essays until the last English lectures that he wrote. He does go back to language quite a bit, and there is references to these semiotics throughout, but he never builds it up into a theoretical thing. I think maybe one thing perhaps could be that, you know, post-structuralism enters in a very big way. And once post-structuralism enters in, then all of this stuff gets downplayed, right? Once the selected subaltern studies comes, deconstruction, Foucault, all of these things really downplay all of these things. So there's really no space, and his engagement with it is, you know, people don't maybe understand, or it's not really engaged much with, so it just kind of leaves off. So maybe that could be the case. But I think it is very, I think it, as I tried to say in this whole speech, that is very, it has a lot of potential if we take it seriously. Religion, what can be excised? So, oh, you're saying that Dipesh is saying in the chapter, it's not necessarily about religion, but about what can be excised, right? What is excised, right? What is excised in a historical reading? Yeah, but I also think Guha is, by talking about semiotics, he's also asking that same question, right? He's what is, when you take up, when you have a certain semiotic frame, right? Certain things are, like for instance, the plethora of, you know, the Santal reading gets excised, but does it have to be? Maybe Guha leaves that question a little unclear, and I'm clarifying it, perhaps. But I'm saying that it maybe doesn't have to be, right? Because I'm saying that when Dipesh starts from religion and secularism, as he frames the chapter like that, then the rules, and he talks about disciplines like history, anthropology, and what is excised, then the rules are kind of set through the abstraction, and then, you know, he can discuss in a theoretical way this question, right? I don't think that same methodology was followed by Guha in the prose of counterinsurgency. I don't think he started like that. He built up a semiotic, a system in which we look at meta-interpretation. He is very critical of abstraction. And then he shows, right, something that is, something that is there in the archive, right? And he says it's there. You can see it, right? I can see it. It's there. Now, how can we just understand it? I think that's the question. I think that's he's raising or I'm raising. I don't know. Okay. Rochnati's question of literature. So, is it the political intent? Sorry, I didn't catch the whole thing. The political intent that I'm imparting to historiography that I'm saying cannot be given with literature? Is that the? That's the question, right? Yeah, the raising of the literature question is so on the one hand, I think you're pointing out an interesting sort of maybe tension in what I'm saying. But on the one hand, I'm saying that semiotics allows us to go across the disciplinary boundaries, right? Interpretation, and maybe that could have driven Guha to look at literature, because the iconic, the poetic, all of these things are in language also. Like Jakobson relates the iconic to the poetic function of language, right? So he's building on iconicity, and so he's moving into literature. So it's fine, one can do that, but I'm saying you can also find that, because history is also built on language. You can find that in history too, right? And if you find that in history also, if you look at it in a historic way, then what can happen is that, in historiographical terms, in terms of the social science, memory, relating, all of this stuff like oral history. And when we say oral history, there kind of is a difference than what we say oral literature. There's kind of different valence there, right? Especially when we talk about Adivasi communities. Not everything is, we can't just say everything is like oral literature, because that gives a different, perhaps a different idea of truth to it than when we say it's oral history, or when we apply historiographical method versus literary analysis, although both at the base are linguistic. So in that sense, I'm thinking as I'm responding, but in that sense, I think there could be a political intent there, and maybe it's coming from the Adivasi position, the position, of engaging with in the Adivasi domain, in which so much has been written on oral literature, oral tradition, but not much on oral history, or not oral history, on historiography of, events like the Hul. And finally, Rahi's question, the Santal text archival material. So is it similar and different than Ranajit Guha, what he was doing? Yeah, I think Ranajit Guha didn't really do much with it in that sense. He wrote about the Hul, he wrote and he told us there's many instances in the archive, but he didn't really engage much. But he opened up that engagement. He opened up a possibility for that engagement. Some of that material has been engaged with. Prathama's book has engaged with it. This later work, Peter Stanley's. But even that engagement can be pushed further, I think, especially when we bring language into the picture more. We bring people who have gone and have certain kind of lived memories also, of course, but that still has to be understood within semiotic frames, into local kinds of histories and texts. So I think now there's much more possibility, right? And there can be much more plurilinguistic dialogue within history to make an event like this from different vantage points. An event like the Hul from different vantage points.